Today I'm talking about juggling the dual life of an enterprise open source project. And actually, Steve's final point there was a good one. He talked about don't burn yourself out. And actually, I'm mostly going to be talking on that aspect. It's about how to have an open source project that is sort of company sponsored or company authored, but how to manage it and how to keep it manageable. All right. So in general, open source, it's great. Well, Steve actually introduced this really well, but it's great for companies and community alike. But it can have pitfalls. Popular projects can get pulled in many directions. So once you open source something, assuming it's not the single source like Steve talked about, people in the community can want a project to go in multiple directions. And another challenge with enterprise open source is that enterprise customers do have different expectations about release frequency and stability. And then the final point is that I'll talk about it's important to automate to maintain quality. So just a quick one, I called this like enterprise open source. I'm using that term. I kind of made that up, so just picked it arbitrarily. So just to give you an idea what I mean by that, I mean sort of an open source project that originates from a company rather than an individual, and which has continued like steering and usage by the original company. So the type of open source project I'm talking about, because it's hard to really capture everything, as Steve mentioned, there's lots of different approaches. So one that's enterprise originated and managed, one that is widely adopted. I mean, there's no point in open sourcing things if people aren't going to use it. Importantly, I'm going to cover the use case where it has an active community of contributors, maybe even maintainers. So the non-single source approach. It contains features the managing enterprise doesn't use, right? So, there may be things that are not of interest to the company who originally open sourced it, but it is good for the project itself, good for the community, so they get added. And then the final important point of this kind of case study is that the project is used as an integral internal component to some other enterprise software. All right, so in terms of what it's not really about, just to clarify, it's not really about the type of projects where it's like so big it has a dedicated team, or where the enterprise retains complete control or development. All right, so moving on to this case study. So the open source project is RenovateBot. It's hosted on GitHub, as most open source these days are. It's not actually 19 years old, as GitHub thinks. Somehow there's a year 2000 commit there. But you'll see it has 7,000 commits, 4,000 releases, 27 pull requests. It's pretty active. Now, on the flip side of that, at WhiteSource, we have an enterprise software called WhiteSource Remediate. Now, Remediate is not like the paid version of Renovate, really. It's not. This is not the type where it's withhold things to get premium features, that type of stuff. It's more that we found that we could open source 90% of what Remediate does as this project called Renovate, and have a really great community project that still allows us to continue with our kind of enterprise projects or enterprise products, which in this case is called WhiteSource Remediate. So Renovate is a project for automatically updating dependencies, whereas Remediate has these capabilities to be able to do real-time monitoring for vulnerabilities and patching vulnerabilities and things like that. Very similar concepts. A closer look at Renovate. So the graph that you see at the top left, I realize they're both orange. This is weekly commits. So you can see that there is somewhere between 20 to 40 weekly commits, which is pretty high. I mean, there are obviously many projects that have higher, but this is a pretty regularly updated project. We have 250 contributors, some of which are bots, and there might be some duplicates, but essentially we've got 200 plus people that have contributed code, nearly all of which are not WhiteSource employees. And if we look at the middle and at the bottom in the last month, You can see some more stats there. So, for example, 47 closed issues, 53 new issues. So, around 100 a month active issues, 162 active pull requests. So there's quite a lot going on here. And this is the open source side. On the closed source side, we say white source Remediate. So this is commercial software, and it's part of a wider piece we call white source for developers. It's adapted from the open source Renovate, adding the vulnerability awareness and remediation. And we typically release this in 2-week sprints, and we use agile methodology. So this is quite different. This is, a more traditional enterprise approach to software as compared to to open source. And one of the other key things is that when it comes to enterprise software, customers also expect a lot of stability. So anyway, let's talk about that, juggling that dual life between a piece of open source, which is fairly free, as in beer and speech, but also it is developed quite freely, versus our enterprise software, where we use it as part of, where we want that to be kind of stable, predictable, etc. So as I said, Steve gave a great overview of different types of open source. So here's our open source approach at the high level. We welcome contributions which would benefit the community, even if they're not important to white source directly. So we do not say no to an idea or a feature just because we wouldn't use it ourselves. We'll only say no if we think that doesn't benefit the project or the wider community. We have 3 project maintainers of the open source project, one of which is me, but 2 of which are unrelated to white source. We attempt to review submitted pull requests as quickly as we can, same day a lot of the time. And we release continuously. We have continuous delivery. So per feature or per fix, we push out new releases. Something that's important to note is that, so as I said, it's not like an upsell. Remediate is a different product to Renovate, but Renovate is a very important dependency for Remediate. It's not like just a regular dependency that you can leave non-updated for a while. Because we at White Source are in the business of open source dependencies, we can't ship our software with our own dependencies out of date. That would just not look good, and would not benefit our customers. Also, package managers and platforms like GitHub and GitLab, they're rapidly progressing, so the software does need to keep up. Basically, in short, we need to update Renovate regularly as part of our commercial offering. So in terms of juggling the heavy lifting, juggling that dual life, the heavy lifting really is done in open source. In terms of how we can manage that, not burn ourselves out, find the balance. The key things are automated tests with full coverage. This certainly helps us a lot. We use bots for checking things like pull request titles, contributor license agreement. It's not a CLA agreement, and also a work in progress bot. We have a bot for automating dependency updates, which is Renovate itself. We automatically release using semantic release. We automatically publish to NPM and Docker Hub. And we also automate our documentation, both like testing during pull requests as well as generation. And this is the way that we find that we're able to kind of support the community very well, not burn ourselves out, while also allowing the project to kind of go as quickly as it would like to go. All right, so first point is continuous integration and testing. We're on GitHub. We're using GitHub Actions for our tests. So you can see here, maybe half of that is the GitHub Actions. Below that, you'll find the other ones I mentioned. So, for example, because we release every commit, we need pull requests to be correctly formatted in their title. So is it a feature, is it a fix, and is it a breaking change? So the semantic pull request bot automates that. The pull request doesn't pass unless the pull request has been named with one of those semantic prefixes. We have a work in progress bot, which lets people mark a pull request as a work in progress so it doesn't get accidentally merged. We check code coverage and enforce that coverage is always 100%. And importantly, for enterprise open source, we also have a contributor license agreement bot that automatically checks that all pull requests have had the contributor agreement agreed to, just so that we don't get ourselves into any problems with rights to use. In terms of releasing, once a merge request has been successfully, passing all the tests and passing our manual reviews, one of my opinions is that if you, in an open source project, if you need to decide when and what to release, in many cases, that's an unnecessary burden, right? So if we're talking about how not to burn out, how to make it manageable, just releasing every time actually works extremely well for us. Because, often you get like contributors, for example, contribute a feature, contribute a fix. And of course, the second you merge it, they ask, well, when will this be released? I'd love to use it. So the answer is basically, within minutes, there is a release. And certainly within an hour or so, we get a build that's pushed to NPM and also pushed to Docker Hub. So we found that this works really well for us. In the early days of the project, one of the first issues, maybe not one of the first issues, but one of the first outside contributor issues, maybe about 2 years ago, was called too many releases. And someone just said, you released too much. And again, that was probably someone with we'll call it the enterprise approach to releasing, where they would like something every 2 weeks or a month instead of 5 times a day. Now, the other thing where releasing makes things good for us is it also makes pinpointing faults much easier. So when people are using the product, and they may use it in many ways that we don't need to use it, this being community use, if they say, well, something broke, that's the worst type of bug. It's very nice that we can say to people, if you can work out which was the last working release, or at least tell us when was it working for you, and when you upgraded, what's the version. This makes it a lot easier to pinpoint faults. Because otherwise we would have to do, a lot more checking ourselves. Whereas now we can kind of lean on the community more and say, okay, well, we're really sorry we broke something, or someone else broke something. But like, if you can work out what commit it was, or what release it was, I should say, then normally that narrows it down to like 1 or 2 commits at most. So basic automated releasing works very well for us in keeping the burden low. All right, so documentation. Steve again talked a lot about this, about sometimes documentation is used as the upsell. So in this case, it's kind of the opposite. We obviously, good documentation benefits both open source and enterprise. It is very easy to under-document in open source projects, not as a business model, but just in general, right? Because, people write a feature, they submit a fix, and they don't document it. Right. And so you may have the choice between like, well, do we accept it as is and just say, yeah, we'll document it next, or could you document it soon? The reality is that if you do it that way, you get behind in your documentation. And the less documented something is, the harder it is to support open source. So assuming that, documentation is not part of your business model, having great documentation in open source really lowers the effort required. So what we do is that we ensure that, first of all, every configuration option in the open source tool has a description field. So you can't create like a new feature without having a description. And then we also have a freeform markdown document, which is like extended description. And we have a test that makes sure that every feature also appears in that document as a heading, even if the content is empty. And what this means is that instead of us having to kind of push people and lean on people, there's an automated test that basically says missing documentation. And this has worked very well. We quite rarely have to actually remind people, it's quite clear as part of the project that if you write a feature, then you add documentation for it as part of the project. So this is sort of on the open source side. Excuse me. All right, I'm gonna assume that you can see. No. I'm bringing it back. Thank you for your patience. All right. Stacy, can you reshare that? Thank you. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so documentation, good yeah, what am I talking about? I said adoption of commercial releases. So we usually upgrade it every sprint. We don't always take the very latest. I mean, sometimes that's impossible. Like if we've made major changes, we don't want to push that into our commercial product. But you know what? Open source users are often waiting for a feature or fix. I mean, you generally don't add a feature or fix unless someone needs it. And so what that means is that the person who needs it, who's benefiting from it, does get to test it first. And that helps us a lot. As much as we attempt to, to test it, people test it in real applications when they need it. We also have a hosted version, so we actually run it sort of as a free service, and we have like over 150,000 repositories there. So we generally deploy there before we deploy into our enterprise release, and this helps a lot. Ultimately, also with our commercial release, we lean on the open source documentation, and we don't duplicate it. So having great documentation also benefits us there. Support. All right, so open source Renovate is supported on GitHub. That's one of the key things. This is how we keep our support manageable for the open source. So the open source project is supported on GitHub using issues, like most open source projects. We're in GitHub all the time. So questions are usually answered in minutes or hours. And White Source, though, we naturally have a commercial support process via emails and portals. So it creates a little bit of friction at times. So one thing is we don't obviously advertise White Source support for Renovate. It's not an upsell for us. So we don't have any information about it. But some people do look it up. So some people go to the effort of looking up how to contact White Source support. Volume, though, of this is not very high. Maybe only less than 5% of questions try to go to our commercial support. And we generally, if we can't answer them in a sentence, we will politely refer them back to the GitHub repo and ask them to post in. So this is how we keep the separation between like commercial support and open source support. All right. In terms of like what I call developer relations, like all open source can be developer relations, but how do we deal with developers? Initially, we had a Gitter channel, but I actually closed that down. It turned out to be problematic because it did become overwhelmed by what I'll call lazy support questions. So people would, look at the different ways to talk to people in the project, and they'd see that you're online and just jump in. And instead of troubleshooting things first, they would want to have like real-time support. So that actually didn't work for us as much as I would love to have that. What we do now is we have a private Slack channel. And so basically, if anybody is developing, we have a note that says, don't develop on your own, email us to get a link. And we add people there so that when people need help developing, then they can talk to us. I would say that the friction where people have to ask for an invite is unfortunate. Like I would love if there wasn't friction, but it has cut the support load, the real-time support load to almost zero because people respect that that's a development channel, not support. So this is something I'd love there to be a better solution for, but it works pretty well for now. All right, so just wrapping up, the benefits of open sourcing components, and I wanted to be clear that this is sort of about when a company says, hey, we've got this great tool we built and a lot of people could benefit from us, and it doesn't, threaten our core business in any way to open source this. That can be of great benefit to the community and to you, but you do need to plan for how to handle the success of it. I mean, there's no point open sourcing parts if no one uses it. But at the same time, if people do, it produces pressure on things like, reviewing pull requests, releasing, and support. The biggest thing I can say is that the automation is a key. So when you automate tests, when you automate releases, and then in our case, you automate documentation. I forgot to mention that documentation is actually automatically built as well. So it's built using also GitHub Actions, and it's published using GitHub Pages. And this means that, again, we don't have to worry about people chasing us for when is the documentation up to date. So doing all these things also means not only that it's good for the community, not only that it keeps our workload low, but also means that then the project is in a very good shape for us to adopt into our own commercial software without major pains. Because if we were releasing sloppily, non-tested, non-documented, and things like that, and lots of features in one release, that would actually make it hard on ourselves. So this automated testing, release, and documentation is really, I'd say, key. I mean, to any open source project, but especially if you're open sourcing a component of your full solution that you need to keep using yourself so that it doesn't get out of control.